this could also be a sign of a kind of insubordination among members of the Putin circle, heads of security services, heads of the military, border services, that, maybe they're thinking enough is enough, and maybe it's time to end this war. So we didn't see a real instant kind of robust Russian response to the Ukrainians coming in, and that was something I think the West and others should take note of.
Okay. New Year's Eve marks 25 years since Vladimir Putin first came to power in Russia. He became acting president after the sudden resignation of President Boris Yeltsin. 3 months later, he took the role officially after winning the presidential election. A quarter of a century later, his grip on power seems as resolute as ever, but he faces problems on all sides. The Russian economy is in crisis. The Ukraine war has now spanned nearly 3 years, and now Putin has had to apologize for the Azerbaijan Airlines crash. So what lies ahead for him and his nation? Well, with me to discuss this are two experts on Russia: Edward Lucas, the author, Times contributor, and senior fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. Hello, Edward.
Hello.
Hello. And we've also got Michael Bociurkiw, Global Affairs Analyst and Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council. Michael, hello to you.
Hi, Henry. Good to be with you again.
It's great to be with you again. Okay, so 25 years on, what do we say about Putin and what he's brought to Russia in that quarter century? Because he came through after the turbulent time of Yeltsin, promising to be a guy who would stabilize things. And of course, over that period, he's talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union being a great tragedy for Russia, for history, and also wanting to, I suppose, secure Russia's borders, but although some people say he wants to expand them.
Well, I remember very clearly the 1990s when I was covering Russia as the Economist's bureau chief, and this feeling of sort of chaos and humiliation and complete uncertainty about what was going to happen. And Putin's great strength is that he's given Russians a feeling of stability, that you may not like the corruption, you may not like the nationalism, you may not like all sorts of things, but you know that today is going to be pretty much like yesterday and tomorrow is going to be pretty much like today. And that feeling of what Russians call stabilnost is still his trump card. He's also given Russians the feeling that they are a country that really matters. Nobody patronizes Russia or says you can ignore Russia now, and that was a feeling during the 1990s. There was a huge boom in the oil and gas revenues, so that allowed him to pay off Russia's debts and to put the economy back on some kind of firmer footing. Of course, the big question really is that the Ukraine war has undone a lot of that, and so the economy is now popping rivets all over the place. There's all sorts of imbalances and difficulties there. And although Russia's made some headway in Ukraine and has shown countries in Africa and Latin America that it's a force to be reckoned with when it comes to standing up to the West, it's also come at a huge cost. And so I think the question for Putin next year is whether he tries to cash in his winnings, whether he tries to keep going, or whether he pushes it too far and maybe has some unexpected reverses.
Yep. Michael, thank you. Edward, Edward, sorry about that.
I am Edward.
Yes, indeed. Michael, some people may not remember, but at one point the G7 was the G8, and Putin was considered by George W. Bush and Tony Blair to be somebody they could do business with. Not quite Gorbachev, but he was leaning towards us. That's changed so much. What do you think changed it?
Well, people like Mr. Blair and others, they've also said things like we can do business with the just deposed leader of Syria. So I think they get it wrong a lot. I think what's changed is Mr. Putin has really developed this sense of superiority, of infallibility. But, I agree with everything Edward said there, but I travel, most of the time, as you know, I'm in Ukraine, but I have been traveling the world this past year. And whether I go to Thailand or I was just in India, you hear a lot of Russian, and that's really interesting. In places where you never heard Russian before, that's because so many of Russians have left, a lot of their best and brightest, and setting up shop in places like Thailand because they are very, very unhappy with the way things are going in Russia. And above and beyond that, they're afraid of getting trapped in the meat grinder machine which represents Putin's war on Ukraine. The one thing about Mr. Putin is he has an interesting friendship club. What I mean by that is his willy ability to get around sanctions, which has prevented the Russian economy from collapsing altogether. And that's because he keeps friends like Tehran, in Pyongyang, and in Beijing. And it was especially during COVID, I wrote this in my book, Digital Pandemic, where there was the one group of people racking up frequent flyer miles while all of us were feeling sorry for ourselves at home were the Chinese, because a lot of them were coming to Russia to school them how to get around sanctions. And that's something which I think the Western leaders didn't plan for. In fact, I'm from Canada, and Prime Minister Trudeau said at the start of the war with Ukraine, the sharpest tool in the shed that we have are sanctions. Well, it didn't turn out that way. So, long story short, he has this lasting ability to stay in power, and that reason for that is he puts away opponents. He's clamped down on the media. He's clamped down on NGOs. He's gotten rid of super opponents like Mr. Navalny. And one last thing is that he knows how to control the oligarchs, the guys who own the wealth in Russia. If you get on his wrong side, you'll either fall out of a window somewhere,
Yes.
or you'll be shot dead. So, yeah, that's something he's got patted down very, very well, I thought.
Thank you, Michael. Edward, over the past, nearly 3 years, there have been rumors and claims about a palace coup, people in the Kremlin being very unhappy with Putin. But at the same time, we also hear that he is emboldened, that he wants to go beyond what he's done since February 2022. And there is talk of an imminent Russian assault on one or more of the Baltic states. In fact, you were posting on X about it only the other day. What do you think? Could that really happen?
I think that just because Russia's weak doesn't mean that Russia's safe. And just because Putin's in trouble doesn't mean that he becomes easier to deal with. So I think that there's a strong argument that as Russia becomes in greater economic difficulty, the danger is they roll the dice, they become more reckless. So I do think that there's a war raging right now, actually, all over Europe, but particularly on the Baltic seabed, with brazen Russian sabotage of gas pipelines, of electricity power cables, and of data links. And the West is really struggling to get to grips with that. And that is attacking our decision making, our unity, our credibility. So that's going on. I also think Putin's grip on power is more fragile than we think. And we saw in the summer of last year with the Prigozhin mutiny, how very quickly, given a credible challenger, this sort of unpleasant, sort of slightly psychopathic, sort of fascist warlord, and suddenly people were saying, yippee, new leader. And as he marched, it was like Napoleon marching from Elba to Paris, and people switching sides as he went. But then something went wrong, and he didn't go all the way to Moscow, and ended up with his plane blowing up in midair, and Putin was back in the saddle again. But this regime is like a meringue. It looks very impressive, but it's actually quite brittle. And if there was any challenge to Putin, I think it could lead to his downfall quite quickly. But on the other hand, he may go on for a couple of years. And I think the great danger here is wishful thinking. We have one load of wishful thinking that says Russia's losing, another load of wishful thinking that says Russia won't really attack us, another load of wishful thinking that says Putin's going to be out any moment, so we don't need to worry. And perhaps the biggest wishful thinking that whoever comes after Putin will be better.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that, Edward. Michael, a few days ago, we were surprised to hear that Vladimir Putin was conceding that Russia may have been responsible for the downing of an Azerbaijan Airlines aircraft. He didn't say it was us, but he said, sorry. What does that indicate to you?
I think it indicates that we are getting closer to Russia coming out and saying, yes, we did it, but sorry, it was a mistake. And what they're going to do, typical of the Russian playbook, is to blame it on the Ukrainians. They sent all of these drones over. We had to shoot them down. The Ukrainians are making the skies unsafe. So, there should be a lesson to them. So the other factor here, of course, Henry, is that relations between Russia and Azerbaijan are pretty important in the Kremlin's eyes. And if this was another smaller state, Putin probably wouldn't have called the leader twice and had a chat with him about this airplane. So, that's one thing. But the other thing, if I could just, I don't want to sound like I agree with everything Edward Lucas says, but he is bang on in what he just said about Putin, and that he isn't as strong as he looks. And yes, the Prigozhin thing, I mean, my goodness, look how close he got to Moscow. But then the other thing is going back a few months, and when the Ukrainians had the invasion into Kursk, they just rolled over that border, despite the fact they were supposed to have, the Russians were supposed to have spent tens of millions of dollars to bolster that border, but there was nothing to hold them back. And look how far they got. And I think this points to a couple of things. Number one is years and years of corruption in the Russian Defense Ministry, where they haven't the defenses that we thought. And then secondly, as some of your colleagues in the British media indicated at the time, is that this could also be a sign of a kind of insubordination among members of the Putin circle, heads of security services, heads of the military, border services, that, maybe they're thinking enough is enough, and maybe it's time to end this war. So we didn't see a real instant kind of robust Russian response to the Ukrainians coming in, and that was something I think the West and others should take note of.
Okay.